Well, thanks, Alex. So welcome again, everybody. As Alex has mentioned, this is sort of a companion piece, follow-up to Wires to Wheels, electric cars or vehicles in Canada and beyond. And this represents some of the sort of interesting backstory and side stories we've dug up about these vehicles in our collection while researching the broader exhibit. Before I go any further, I got to give big special thanks to Jeff Lee and Galen Handy, whose primary source research and documents on this project have been incredibly helpful. We've learned so much more about our cars thanks to both of them. So we're going to be talking about 5 different alternative energy vehicles tonight. That is to say 3 electrics, 1 hybrid, and a steam car. They span 110 years of motoring history, and at the time of this presentation include the Automotive Museum's oldest vehicle and its newest. So we'll begin with that oldest vehicle, our Woods electric brake. It doesn't look like much, we know, that's a work in progress, but it is possibly, we're not 100% sure on this, the 2nd or 3rd oldest commercial electric vehicle on Earth, and certainly the oldest electric vehicle in Canada. Bit of nomenclature here. What is a brake? It's a type of carriage back in the day, usually like covered with bench seats, open topped, sort of a mixed cargo passenger carriage. And in the very early days of motoring, the term came to refer to a 4 or 6-seater open car with bench seats, sort of the ancestor of what we now call a station wagon, very indirectly. And the story of our Woods electric brake begins with this fellow, Clinton E. Woods. He's an American electric vehicle pioneer. He literally wrote the first book on electric cars. You can see a copy of it on the right there. That's from 1900. He got his start as a power plant technician and eventually would found his first electric car company, American Electric Vehicle Company, in 1895. He had some creative problems with their board, though, and left it to actually go work for a company that was supplying parts and especially bodies to American Electric, the Fisher Equipment Company. And by 1898-ish, he had started manufacturing cars of his own design under the Woods brand for Fisher. So our Woods car is technically a Woods Electric by Fisher. You may have seen it referred to as a Fisher Electric in some of our older marketing material. Not strictly speaking wrong, but it's more proper to call it a Woods. So in 1898, Woods was advertising a whopping 20 different body styles of moto vehicles, electric as they called them. And they were all pretty much the same basic design, as we'll see in the next sort of catalog shot of our vehicle. These are really, really bare bones cars. They're basically just carriages with an electric motor attached to each of the back wheels. There's some interesting quirks of that made them, by the time, fairly impressive. Having motors geared directly to the back wheels is a weird system. It's even weirder because the gears were covered in leather. This made the cars actually quite quiet and fairly good at resisting the bumps and shocks of really terrible early roads, but the gears had to be replaced constantly. That's a running thing you see in Woods, is like, where can I get new gears for my Woods? They were powered by a bank of batteries stored in that little sort of louvered compartment you can see under the seats, and the controls were extremely simple. You've got a big curved steering tiller on the left there, a power switch under the driver's legs or at their feet, and then just to their left by the lamp, a steering handle, or sorry, an accelerator control that also doubles as the brake, which is pretty typical of electric cars for the time. So by 1899, Fisher was doing pretty well. They were exporting electric cars as far away as London, Paris, Antwerp, Toronto, and Honolulu, of all places. They seem to have done fairly well in Hawaii. We're not entirely sure why. But it's their Toronto connection that we want to talk about tonight. And we've got some newspaper headlines to prove it. These are 3 clippings from the Toronto World from 1898 and 1899, which outline a bit of sort of how Woods had an impact in Canada. Now, bear in mind, Toronto had already seen its first electric car. F.B. Fanshawe and William Still had built Canada's first electric in 1893, and Fanshawe was actively driving it at the time. But this was also at the time when Still was gearing up his first Canadian Still Motor Company electric car factory. So we're still not exactly sure on the dates, but it may be that Woods actually beat Still to the punch in driving an electric truck on Toronto streets. And that's where our first headline, "A Coach Without a Horse," comes in. So in August of 1898, the Robert Simpson Company department store bought a Woods delivery van. We're not sure exactly what body style. We presume some kind of a closed van, but we don't have any details or photos of it. They were using it for regular daily delivery runs. If you ran it first thing in the morning, charge it over lunch, and then ran it again in the afternoon, it could manage about 100 kilometers. And they would actually charge it directly off municipal light posts. Apparently, you could just wire it into the base of the post, and it ran at the same voltage as city power. So different times. This clearly left an impact. For one thing, a lot of other companies in Toronto started buying electric delivery wagons, mostly from Still. But by February of 1898, there was the headline, "Exit to the Old Time Horse," talking about demonstrations of Woods vehicles. Quote, "The poetry of motion on wheels was exemplified yesterday in the city by the display of the Woods motor vehicles, manufactured by the Fisher Equipment Company of Chicago. 5 different styles were on view: a piano box buggy, a Victoria, a brake, a hansom, and a coupe." Now, I'd like to imagine that our car is the brake that is mentioned there. I have no proof of that. Don't quote me on that one, but it would be really, really cool. Another interesting takeaway from this article is that Canadian General Electric had actually bought the rights to build them in Canada. They were at least assembling them at a factory in Peterborough. And it gives some great early writing about what it was like to drive through Toronto in an electric car circa 1899. Quote, "Speeding on and off car tracks with very little jolt east on Adelaide. That sensation discounted horse hacks and trolley cars by a great deal." So interesting enough, this is a situation where in the 1890s, an American electric car company is building electric vehicles in Canada, and doing so with at least some amount of interest. By September of 1899, money is really starting to move around. Our third headline, "Canadians are in this big company," talks about Canadian investment in the new company that Fisher had just spun off that they called Woods Motor Vehicle. So the new Woods company had substantial Canadian support. It was based in Chicago, but a lot of the money came from Canada. Its board of directors now included members of Canadian General Electric, the Canadian Bank of Commerce, the VP of Dominion Bank, and none other than the chairman of Canadian Pacific. So these were literally the wealthiest industrialists in Canada, pouring vast sums of money, $10 million, into this American electric car company. And the reason for that is, well, this weird, it's a long, complicated story, but suffice it to say, in between 1899 and 1901, everybody who had lots of money in the United States was convinced that electric taxi cabs were the next big thing. And several big electric taxi cab trusts and monopolies were being formed to build taxi cab networks in all these major cities, including Toronto. The Woods Syndicate was hoping to compete with the Electric Vehicle Company, who held a bunch of valuable battery patents, and they started building taxi cab fleets for use in New Haven, New York, Buffalo, Hawaii, and Toronto. Unfortunately for the company and for Clinton Woods, this whole thing turned out to be a massive bubble of hype. None of these early electric taxi cab companies were remotely profitable. And, well, Woods left the company in 1900, and the whole business went into bankruptcy the next year. Now, Woods would continue as a brand for several more years, this time primarily under American control. This is a Woods Electric from 1910. And they'd actually keep making electric cars until about 1918. One of their last big innovations that makes them stand out for a little while longer than some of the other failing electric car companies at the time is this. This is a vehicle from the collection of the Henry Ford Museum. This is called a Woods Dual Power. And it's actually the United States's, and by extension North America's, first true commercial hybrid car built between 1916 and 1918. For all that it's an interesting design, Woods was rapidly going bankrupt while they were trying to sell these, so they didn't have much of a historical splash. But the Woods Dual Power wasn't the only hybrid car being built at this time. Hybrid technology has been around for longer than most people think, and was fairly popular at the time. It seemed to combine the best of gasoline cars and electric cars. So our next vehicle is actually Canada's first hybrid car, the Galt, specifically the Galt Gas-Electric. Great name. So Galt, Ontario was a wealthy textile community, and between 1911 and 1913, the city's wealthy investors, supported by the city council, had actually opened a local car company called Galt Motors. They ran into some pricing and quality control issues and went out of business, but most of their stock was bought up by Moffat St. Clair and Eddie Fleming, who were two local electricians who ran a power generator business. So they basically flipped these cars and saved a bunch of parts, to rebuild into the chassis you see here, their storage gas-electric car, launched in August of 1914, which was Canada's first hybrid and a really, really impressive first hybrid. So it was powered by an extremely fuel-efficient two-stroke engine, 2 cylinders with pre-compression, driving a commercial Westinghouse generator, which in turn powered the wheels. That gave you a top speed of about 50 kilometers per hour, which is pretty good for the time. But important thing, no transmission, no gear shifting whatsoever. This was a very, very smooth ride. The really impressive thing with the Galt is fuel efficiency. This thing in 1914 could manage 80 miles per gallon. That's 34 kilometers per liter. That's better than most modern hybrid cars, or at least comparable. And this is in 1914. And on top of all that, you could actually switch it over to a pure electric mode for about 30 kilometers of range. So this was a modern style plug-in hybrid car before the First World War, basically. Another neat little feature that didn't stick around on the car, unfortunately, is the Cyclops headlight you can see there. It actually turns to point where the wheel is pointing. It's fun. I don't know if it provides any serious advantage. But for all that St. Clair and Fleming had a really interesting car, the town of Galt was sick of car production and sick of car startups. They had a ton of trouble finding funding, and the car had been quite expensive and complex to build. So they only ended up making 2 of them. They sold one to a buyer who crashed it within a few weeks. And I'm not entirely certain, I've been trying to verify this story, but apparently it got recycled and repurposed into the emergency generator for the local movie theater. Not entirely clear on this. But they were left with one surviving car, which was working fine. And so St. Clair just kept using it. For decades, actually. He upgraded it at some point with a more modern body. That's the sort of curved convertible style body you can see here. And it was just his regular family car until around 1927. He took it on several long road trips down to the United States to try to interest investors in buying the thing. No dice. By the 1920s, this was not that impressive a design. Gas cars were getting much better. And at some point in the early 1930s, he sold it to a former employee, Wallace Fairgrieve, who fitted it out with its current body that it has to this day. Long story short, the car passes into the hands of collectors in the 40s and 50s, was briefly on display at Casa Loma in Toronto, and was eventually acquired by auto historian Glenn Beckler, who donated it to us at the Automotive Museum in 1971, where it rests to this day. And it's just come back from a long stay in California on display there, and is really one of the coolest cars in the collection. I love the Galt. It's really stylish. So the Galt and the Woods, as we've seen, were really a product of this one very short period in motoring history, the golden age of the electric car, we call it, just before the First World War. And our next car comes from, let's call it the brass or the tinsel age of the electric car, when the whole business was not just actively declining, but actually falling apart. And that car is our 1919 Rauch Lang C55. So Rauch Lang had started as a blacksmithing shop in Cleveland in the 1850s, and then rapidly grown into a big, luxurious carriage manufacturer. And in 1902, they started selling licensed Buffalo electric cars in their showroom, which sold so well, the company said, okay, we can build all the parts except for the electric components. Let's buy an electric company and just make our own cars. And they did, and they were very successful. By 1911, Rauch Lang was in about the top 5 of electric car producers in the United States. Production numbers aren't huge. They're only making about 700 cars a year, but this is not a big car market, so 700 is pretty impressive. That success didn't last very long, though. These were extremely expensive cars, extremely slow, expensive cars. By 1915, the company actually merged with their main rival, Baker Electric. You'll see some later ads for these vehicles under the brand name Baker Rauch Lang. And when they produced this vehicle, they were very much on the way out. Their cars hadn't really changed much since about 1910, and sales were reflecting that. These are really sort of archetypal electric cars from the period. They've got that weird combination of ultra luxury and very, very, very simple mechanical design. They're big, they're heavy, they're closed body in a time when closed body cars aren't common. They've got that high fishbowl ceiling you can see in all the pictures to allow, of course, for the wearing of hats inside. That was considered to be a very important asset. They were mostly marketed towards a female clientele who it was assumed were afraid of faster gasoline cars and wanted something simple and slow and non-threatening and quiet. They were powered by a worm drive, as you can see on the little Rauch Lang key fob there, that made them very, very slow, but very good torque, good for hill climbing. And it also allowed sort of the entire transmission to be one sealed unit where you didn't have to top it up with oil. You could just replace the whole thing when it started to go bad, which again was assumed to be like an asset for car-shy consumers. Another interesting feature of the Rauch Lang, which you can kind of see in the highlight image there, is the front seats actually rotate 180 degrees. And the idea was you could pass the steering tiller back to the back seat and the passengers in the front could chat with the driver as they drove from the back. Again, this is a car for socialites. This is a car for the ultra rich, for them to go to the opera in, that kind of thing. It was assumed to be basically like a traveling luxury salon for you. So Baker Rauch Lang would continue to build and sell cars from their Cleveland factory until early 1920, when they started downsizing heavily and moved to a much smaller facility in Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts. Still operating at a loss, they went out of business in 1923. Now, the brand name continued on as a car body brand and making magnetic transmission cars, which were sort of, but not quite hybrids, until about 1932. But they really did go the way of the dodo in about 1920. So our C55, our Rauch Lang, is from probably one of the last production batches in the original Cleveland factory. It was loaned to the Automotive Museum by Kenneth Peaker in 1972 and actually permanently entered our collection in 1995. So we've had it for quite some time. So as we've seen, the electric car industry is basically non-existent by the mid-1920s. Gasoline cars are dominating, but there is a third way, and that is steam cars. The steam technology had been very familiar in the 1890s and 1900s, very advanced, very sort of mature technology. And so steam cars had kind of trickled along on their own. And our Brooks steam car, which is one of the only sort of remotely modern Canadian steam cars, represents a sort of last gasp of steam car technology, as well as some kind of a spicy historical controversy. So in 1923, Stratford, Ontario was a very prosperous railway town with a population of experienced steam train workers and engineers who were pretty accustomed to seasonal layoffs and were always, looking for work in the steam business. And that year, American financier, Toronto bank owner, and all-around smooth talker Oland J. Brooks bought up a local, I believe, lawnmower factory and incorporated Brooks Steam Motors Limited in Stratford. And the company rapidly produced a prototype, which was basically a slightly improved copy of the somewhat popular, but sort of going out of favor, American Stanley steam car with a modernized body. The Brooks was extremely expensive and not particularly fast. It had a reputation for losing steam after about a half an hour at highway speeds. But it was like a functional, fairly safe car. One of the big advantages of steam cars is if you're willing to sit through the very painful process of getting them started, they are exceedingly easy to drive and really, really fast. Jay Leno famously has been pulled over for speeding on California highways several times in steam cars from the 1910s and 1920s. They're nippy little vehicles if you can handle the incredibly high maintenance requirements. So Brooks had what seemed like a genuine, fairly effective product, and he was an excellent salesman. So by 1924, money was just pouring into the company. Several Brooks cars were taken on coast-to-coast advertising tours. Big, very luxurious dealerships were set up in Ontario and Quebec. There were even sales of Brooks cars to the cities of Stratford and Toronto for use in steam taxi cab services at a loss to the company, just basically for free publicity. The thing is, though, most of the sales apparatus was there selling stock or pre-orders, not actual cars. And this is where things start to get complicated, because what was going on at the Brooks factory was, let's call it mildly sketchy. Brooks had genuinely invested a vast amount of his own money and other people's money, let's be clear, in building this like ultra modern steam car factory and hiring a staff of genuine experts. He headhunted a lot of people from Stanley Steamer to make these cars really good. But he wasn't actually making very many cars. There are lots of stories from former factory workers of them, assembling cars for the benefit of visiting investors. And then the moment the investors left, they would disassemble them to be ready for the next batch. So over the course of just under 5 years of production, Brooks only actually made about 180 cars. And they've been promising and selling thousands of them. So the money ran out in 1927. Brooks is basically kicked out of his own company, hounded by investors and creditors, leaves a really bad taste in the city of Stratford. But the big question here, the one that we've never quite satisfactorily confirmed, is just how much of the Brooks was a massive scam and how much of it was a really bad advertising and investment decision. Because yes, none of his investors saw any of the returns, and yes, Brooks kind of made a lot of money off of it, but most of that money he poured back into making more cars. As far as we can tell, he didn't walk away with like billions of dollars. He spent all of these earnings on not actually trying to make cars at all. At some point during the project, he pivoted away from cars and towards this brand new from scratch high-tech steam bus. That all of his engineering people were telling him was the next big thing. And he hoped to have a couple prototypes ready and did get them on the roads in the 1930s. The problem was all of these people who'd poured thousands of dollars into his company hadn't poured money into the company to build steam buses. They wanted cars. So Brooks is forced out of the company in 1927. Production of the steam bus ups and moves down back to the United States. They make a couple steam buses. They go out of business in 1931 and leave a lasting legend in Stratford. This is one of our sort of Brooks adjacent artifacts that I love very much. It's a copy of Man's World with a very saucy article entitled "Brooks Steamer, the car that ran on hot air." That's full of like stories of Olin J. Brooks defrauding elderly widows out of their life savings and sleeping around with his secretaries and like stealing his employees' wives and lots of stuff that we're pretty sure isn't true, but certainly gives you an idea of the kind of stories people in Stratford were willing to tell about Olin J. Brooks and how much he'd cheated them out of their money. So our Brooks is one of 8 known survivors out of that production run of about 180. And it has a fairly long and complicated and interesting story post its construction by Brooks. It somehow ended up in the hands of Gordon Armstrong, who is one of Eastern Canada's most prolific car collectors. The Armstrong collection is really foundational in a lot of Canadian car collections. Cars are made kind of from the 1950s, spread out everywhere. But very long story short, Armstrong owned it in the 1950s. It was bought by the Craven Foundation in 1969, and we acquired it from their collection in 1986. So our Brooks has changed hands a great many times. Now, the idea of sort of what happened with the Brooks. A big out-of-town startup comes in, makes big promises, the next big revolution in transportation, and you can be in at the ground floor, and then collapsing and making off with a lot of money is not exactly a new or an old idea. People have been, making questionable investment decisions for as long as there has been money to invest. And the story of our next vehicle does share some parallels with the Brooks. So very clear, our next car was not probably a scam. This was a real legitimate product, not a scam. So we're jumping ahead 70 years to the early 2000s, when the state of alternative energy transportation in North America was about as bad as it had been in the 1920s. But things were kind of changing. A series of cascading environmentalism and pollution regulations decisions in California mainly had led to the federal governments of Canada and the United States legislating into existence this class of vehicle called LSVs, low-speed vehicles. These were basically small to full-size cars powered by slower, more energy-efficient means of or types of motor that were licensed for road use on everything except full-size highways or major arteries. The idea was usually it's a vehicle that's designed to go no faster than about 50-55 kilometers per hour. So Canada had just licensed these into production. The United States had just licensed these into production. This seemed to be the next big thing. And because the cars were small and simple, they were inexpensive for startups to get in on. So in 2004, 2005-ish, Feel Good Cars of Toronto licenses the chassis design for the microcar MC2, which is a small French subcompact car, and they converted it into what they call the ZENN, the zero emission, no noise car. Basically, what they do is they take a microcar, strip out the engine, strip out the gas tank, and replace them with Canadian batteries and an American electric motor. It's got a top speed of about 40 kilometers per hour, 80-kilometer range, fits nicely into that LSV bracket. So they built LSVs at a factory in Saint-Jérôme, Quebec. spoiler alert on that one, sold them across North America, but ran into some issues. And to talk about some of the concerns and some of the problems with the ZENN, I'm going to turn it over to Canadian comedian Rick Mercer, a childhood favorite of mine, who was himself a very big fan of the ZENN. He did several segments on ZENN and their factory in Saint-Jérôme, and here is one of them.
And now I'm joined by the Vice President of Production here at ZENN Car, Gilles Allard. Hello, Gilles. How are you?
Fine, you?
Nice to see you. You know, it's so hard to wrap your head around the fact that this car is not going to have a gas tank or a muffler.
No.
Nothing.
Nothing.
Just
electric components.
And this is?
This is the rear battery box that we will install.
That's the motor?
That's the motor.
Hello, guys. How are you?
Fine.
Nice to see you. Now, if this gets approved, what do you think you could sell this for in Quebec?
Close to 12,000.
Really?
Yes.
That's a bargain, isn't it?
Today, the price of the car, yeah.
And you use yours all the time?
Yep. Sometime when I go to the gas station and I buy cigarettes, they say, do you have any fuel? No. Look at my little car there. It's a totally 100%.
So you still go to a gas station just to buy cigarettes?
Milk and stuff. And
you're supposed to buy those on a reserve.
Yeah.
Don't you know anything? That's how it plugs in.
Yep. Save money.
I guess, of course, especially if you plug it into your neighbor's house.
Yep.
Just run it right across the backyard.
Don't get caught.
Okay, I'm gonna go for a test drive. Thank you. So obviously, if I drove one of these on my own personal life, this would have a lot to do with reducing my carbon imprint, right? How much?
It'd be huge. It's 6 tons a year if you drive an electric.
6 tons a year.
You drive an electric car, you eliminate 6 tons of CO2 emissions a year.
There's your Kyoto targets right there.
It's right there.
It's so quiet, it's weird, it's like I'm coasting. You know what I want to do? I want to make driving noises. Here we go. Remind me again, what did John Baird say first time he took this for a test spin? The environment minister, what'd he say?
John hasn't been in the car.
Hasn't been in one. And the Minister of Transport?
Ditto.
You know what you can do to get the Conservatives interested in this car? Coal-fired stereo.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. Does it have a stereo?
Yeah, absolutely. Want to hear some tunes?
Yep.
Yeah.
I decided to put it up on the curb because I'm in Quebec. Now I'm going to start it. Look.
Keep it down.
Now listen to this. It's on. Now it's off. Hello, how are you?
Hello, not bad yourself.
Very good. That's a noisy shopping cart you have. Have you seen this before? It's a Canadian car. It's built in Canada. It's manufactured in Canada, but it's illegal to buy here. And it fits under the Christmas tree. It's going.
Is it going?
Yeah, it's going.
No.
It's going now.
No.
There you go. Go for a spin.
That's cool.
So you like it?
I love it. I love it. It's bizarre.
It's weird, isn't it?
It's weird, but it's fun.
You'll get a kick out of this. Look at this.
It's like a coffee maker.
It's like a coffee maker. I think what people are going to want to know, Ian, the consumer's going to want to know before they buy this thing, can a family fit a week's worth of groceries in the trunk of this car?
Absolutely.
Let's put it to the test. Well, there you have it. Ian, thank you so much for the tour and the test drive.
It's a pleasure.
And what's ZENN stand for again?
Zero emission, no noise.
And 20 cases of beer and a box of cereal.
So that does a better job of giving you a peek inside the ZENN car and the environment that it exists at the time. This is a car for the immediately post-Kyoto world where everybody was thinking of carbon footprints and things like that. Gas was fairly expensive, cars were fairly expensive, and it attracted a great deal of local attention. The provincial government of Quebec was fairly keen on this. There was a lot of private and public funding and sort of groundswell support for these cars, but they were kind of hampered by the fairly complicated system for licensing low-speed vehicles in Canada. Basically, they were permitted federally, but then each province or territory had to set up their own guidelines, and that took time. So for most of the ZENN cars production, they could only be driven in Canada, in British Columbia, or in the United States, which obviously hurt sales. Still, they did put together about 500 of them, and they're a really strange car. They kind of all over the place. As you've seen from the video, they're incredibly spacious. They really don't have much of an interior to speak of. There's basically no dashboard, but at the same time, they've got big, really fancy sound systems. A lot of them came with fancy electric sunroofs. And while they're not very fast, it is really, really easy to burn rubber in a ZENN car, or so I've heard. Apparently, the mechanical speed limiter that they're fitted with detaches very handily. So lots of people realize that their tiny, dinky little electric commuter car could do burnouts pretty easily. Interesting little quirk. Now, the ZENN car deal kind of fell apart in 2008, 2009. Basically, the company were setting their sights on bigger projects and wanted to do a longer ranged vehicle they called City ZENN. This was going to be not an LSV, but an actual highway legal long range electric car. And they partnered with an American company called EE Store, who were marketing a revolutionary capacitor-based power storage technology that they said was much more powerful and much more efficient than contemporary batteries. Bear in mind, this is just before lithium-ion batteries are hitting the market. Battery technology is still not great. So ZENN pours a lot of money into EE Store, pours a lot of money into gearing up for production of the City ZENN, and long story short, to this day, EE Store has never publicly demonstrated any of their technology at all. So ZENN was basically falling apart at this point. Their last few cars were produced at a loss to the company of $65,000 per car, which is not great when you're a small startup assembling cars by hand. And they had basically folded by 2009. So our car is a rare thing for us. This is actually a factory demonstrator. This is our car right there in gray at the Montreal Biosphere. So it was given to the Biosphere in 2008 as part of a new exhibit they were doing called, love this exhibit title, the Ecological House. Notice that the cool on the sign is in green, so you know how environmentally friendly it is. But basically to demonstrate new and emerging green energy technologies that would be immediately available to Canadians at the time, like the ZENN was. Our ZENN is a very nice factory demonstrator. It's got all the bells and whistles, including the sunroof and the big fancy sound system. And as far as we can tell, it's actually possibly functional. We're still working on that, seeing if it will drive, but we've certainly yet to find the evidence that it's not, after a change of batteries and some oil, a working car. Another interesting thing, sort of follow to the way the ZENN was developed and the way its licensing worked. If you see on this picture on the back of the car, you'll notice there's a big red and orange reflector triangle. That was one of the quirks of LSVs. You had to have a big reflective sign on the back like a tractor to let people know that you couldn't go faster than about 40 or 50 kilometers per hour. So, like I said, ZENN was given to us by the Montreal Biosphere just this year and is currently on display in our galleries, and you can come in and visit it. It's a neat little vehicle. It's definitely, one of the most unusual cars we have, because it's a French-American-Canadian electric car that's not actually, legally speaking, a real car. It's technically closer in classification to what you might call a golf cart, even though it's capable of much better than golf cart-like performance. But that tragically ends the story of the ZENN and ends the me talking at you part of the presentation. So I'll now open the floor up to questions. Please let me know if you'd like to know more about any of our cars, or if I've said anything blatantly, egregiously wrong.
Thanks, Dumaresq. So we have a few questions right off the start. Let's start with the ZENN because we're just on it. And so Clark was wondering, is the ZENN a front or wheel drive?
It is all front wheel drive, yeah.
All front wheel drive?
Yeah, unlike some electric cars, it's interesting because it does actually have a fair amount of stuff under the hood. Aside from the batteries, the entire rear of the car is basically empty space with some shock absorbers and brakes. There's nothing there. It's one of the reasons why the trunk is so big. So the front of the car is this big mass of, I believe it's a single engine powering a very small limited transmission. It doesn't properly shift gears. It's not really designed to, but it doesn't really need to. But yeah, it's all front wheel drive, all very compact and quite front heavy as I understand it. It's like 2/3 of the weight of the car is under the hood. It's also interesting that the battery box is also exposed to the air, which I thought was a weird choice. There's a lot of strange quirks on the ZENN. But yes, front wheel drive.
Great. Let's shoot back to the Brooks steam car.
Sure.
So how do you fuel a Brooks steam car? Do you want to talk a little bit more about the daily operations of it and what goes in?
The story of how you fuel a Brooks steam car is it's a Kafkaesque nightmare. So you fuel the pilot light with acetylene. Then you fuel the main boiler with kerosene. Then while those are filling up, you have to compress the primary air tanks. And then while that's filling up, you have to compress the primary water tank that feeds the boiler. So the answer to what you fuel a Brooks with is everything all at once. The manual for how to start the Brooks, we have copies of the original manual from the Stratford Perth Museum, and the how to start your car page it's about 50 or 60 steps. And they estimate, and historical evidence backs it up, on a good day, starting a Brooks car takes about half an hour minimum. So yeah, if you can manage all of that, it will run for a while, but getting to that stage is tough. It also doesn't help that a lot of the feeding points for the kerosene, especially the basically gas cap is underneath one of the front seats. You've got to partially disassemble the car just to get it fueled up. And at the very least, the one for all of this process is terrible and awful, it will keep you warm inside the car because you've got like 3 different burners on 3 different fuels going at once. And they thought about safety. There's a 5-mile long cord of piano wire wrapped around the entire engine assembly to keep it from bursting in the direction of the driver. So vitally important for your safety. But yes, I feel like someday we should share the full text of the Brooks steam car manual because it goes on forever. It's one of the longest car manuals I've ever seen.
Yeah. Just to mention, I believe we are having one of our 2023 Zoom talks. Is it April? Is going to be on the Brooks steam car itself.
Yeah. Yes, if I'm not mistaken, Stratford Perth Museum will be sending either one of their curators or one of their programming directors in to tell us the story from on the ground, as it were, and give us all the insight into the financial wheelings and dealings of the history of the Brooks that we are only just learning about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Brooks is quite a story from a local history point of view in Stratford. We often joke it was the most embarrassing thing until Justin Bieber happened to them. So it was quite the story in Stratford. So we're excited. We're gonna flesh that out. There are actually maybe 7 or 8 Brooks steam cars that still exist. They're mostly in museums. There's one in Ottawa at Canada Science and Tech Museum. And I think Western Development Museum has one out in Saskatchewan, and they have one at the Stratford Museum as well. And they're interesting. They're all a little bit different. So we're working with our museum partners to keep telling this story. And just some of the photos we just received a few months ago, actually. So we're still learning. And Roger had a question about how heavy the Brooks is. I know I was just talking about this with someone the other day. It is a leather-bodied car, in fact, because they needed to cut the weight down. But 3,800 pounds is quite a heavy car.
Yeah, it's a hefty beast for the time, and it's worth mentioning that 3,800 pound weight was fixed. It only came in the sedan body style. There were no variations or options. We've seen some advertising material promising that they would eventually develop a smaller, lighter steam car, but never panned out. It was, you got it as a sedan and you got it in black, and those were your only options if you got one.
That's quite heavy and quite expensive for the time as well. So quite an interesting luxury car. So let's shoot back to the ZENN. Just reading Phil's question here. He's saying the batteries would generate nitrogen gas when being charged, hence the open to the atmospheric battery box.
That's a good point. Yes, you're absolutely right, Phil. That didn't click with me, but yes, for sure. I wish I'd realized that. That's a very good point.
Well, these are the cars we just got it in, so we're still learning about it. The ZENN doesn't quite have doesn't have an interpretive panel yet, so still in the works.
Ready for printing soon, I promise.
So, okay, what else? Kevin's pointing out there's a Brooks on Vancouver Island that's operating functionally. So there's just a few that I've heard of that are still in private hands. As one of our board members, Peter Fawcett, once told me, if you don't like fire, you won't like driving a steam car. So even at car shows, and Jay Leno attests to this quite often, people are very concerned when they see flames coming out of your automobile. So it's not something that people at concours events or on the road are really comfortable with. And so there's, even to this day, a lot of discomfort, though. I always imagine that it's going to be the next thing that Tesla comes up with is going to be the 2023 steam car, and off everyone will suddenly, all the celebrities will jump on it because it will shoot flames out of the engine. So
I have to wonder if there is a Brooks in BC. I wonder, from what I've researched, I haven't been able to find out very much about the cross-country tours they did, except that I think there were 2 of them. And driving a car cross country in Canada, even in 1924, that was still a fairly big event. So I have to wonder if the one in BC may have been there since 1924, 1925. I'd be curious. I'm sure Stratford Perth could tell us in detail about exactly where all the cars have been, but that could be a car that's been in the area for as long as, or since production, basically.
Well, it seems like our steam car is taking over our electric car talk, which is fun. So I'm glad we're going to continue on with the Brooks on its own. There were, of course, other much earlier steam cars in Canada. The Brooks is a bit of an oddity in terms of how late it comes about. Really
dozens of early
end of the steam cars even being a relevant thing by the 1920s. But Phil's also wondering about it, but the kind of the transmission that would have.
So as I understand it, there's not much of one. I don't believe the Brooks has. I know it's got. I believe it's rear wheel drive and it's got a differential, but with the way a steam car functions, there's less direct need for gearing, as I understand it, and I don't recall it having a dedicated gear shifting control for the driver. I think it's all basically just manipulation of engine pressure and pressure to the cylinders, as I understand it. I mean, I'd have to go back and peer through the manual, and that's another thing with the Brooks. All the like simplified diagrams of how the car works they have are like 3-page spreads with hundreds of different points. So it is. Actually, they advertise it as having fewer moving parts than a gasoline car, but and thus being less dangerous. But the actual complexity of the car is just mind-boggling. So yeah, as I understand it, it doesn't really have a transmission in the conventional sense.
Okay. One of my favorite stories about the Brooks steam car that I learned from Stratford is there's apparently quite a famous hill, a very steep hill in Stratford, that the sales agents were instructed to use for demonstrating to clients that you wouldn't quote unquote run out of steam in your steam car. Of course, the problem with steam cars is that you would in fact run out of steam if you had driven too far and too fast before you reached said hill at the outskirts of Stratford from where the factory was. And so apparently the sales agents were instructed that you would drive from the factory out to this hill, and then before going up the hill, you would need to make a really big, long speech about how you have enough pressure to go up the hill. It's not a problem. Where in fact you have to buy time in order to gain enough steam pressure to make it up said hill. So they had to somehow wow people with this long meandering talk about steam pressure while actually having to stall time to build up enough steam. So there's quite a lot of quirky stories that come out of Stratford at this time. And when Glenn Becker was writing Cars of Canada back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there were actually quite a number of people that were still alive from the factory days, and so he was able to, compared to some of the, something like the Woods Electric and so forth, was able to gather quite a lot of detail. And the Brooks steamer was also covered widely and very salaciously in the local press compared to other companies at the time that went out of business, say the Durant Motor Car Company here in Toronto, and other things that were far less exciting in terms of their business dealings. So
it's one of the things that really stands out about the Brooks is the amount of vitriol you get even in documents at the time. Like, a lot of people in Stratford had paid a lot of money to Olin Brooks, and they were frankly pissed off about it, and really willing to tell their story to the press. So it's a car that's had a lot of not necessarily very historically accurate, but certainly very emotional recorded response and recorded oral history to it, because it, people did genuinely give Olin Brooks their life savings and lost everything on this flyer of a project. So it's a great story, and I'm excited to talk about it more in January, or in April rather.
Excellent. Dumaresq, can you mention a little bit more of kind of the relevance of the Rauch Lang being in the Canadian Automotive Museum in terms of its Canadian connections? Do we know of how popular electric cars like this were in Canada?
In terms of actual use, their popularity was confined very much to big cities, and especially big cities with electric streetcar networks. So we know that the first proper motor car in Toronto was an electric. That was the Fanshawe. The first proper motor car in Ottawa was probably a Woods. I'm still working on, for our early cars exhibit, working on research to determine if it was actually the first, but both of these ran in parallel with the development of big electric streetcar networks. One interesting sort of ownership fact that I'm still trying to nail down is the first car in Dawson City, which at the time was the capital of Yukon Territory, may have been an electric car, because Dawson had electrical power generation long before it had easy road access. So there's some evidence that an electric made its way up to Dawson in like 1901, 1902 by steamship, and was driven around the city for a while, though I can't imagine electric would have done very well in sort of that kind of weather. So the local and the Canadian connection for the Rauch Lang, the image you see on the left here is actually not an image of a Rauch Lang, it's an image of a McLaughlin Rauch Lang. So in 1911, and as far as I can tell, exclusively in 1911, McLaughlin, who later went on, if you're not familiar with their story, to become General Motors Canada, embarked on this huge marketing blitz across Southern Ontario, saying that, we're teaming up with Rauch Lang, one of the biggest, most respected American electric car manufacturers, to offer a McLaughlin Rauch Lang electric. McLaughlin Buicks were already in the market, and Chevrolets built by McLaughlin were already on the market. So this was nothing new, but it was a nice dovetailing, because McLaughlin was primarily a luxury car brand, and so was Rauch Lang. So they put together tons of advertising. That painting's actually the cover of an advertising brochure. I've found dozens of newspaper ads advertising the car, including some stuff. I'm not entirely clear if they actually exhibited like an Oshawa-built car at the 1911 or 1912 Toronto Auto Shows, or whether it was just a regular Rauch Lang. But they did all this hullabaloo, and then nothing materialized, and it sort of never came up again. So I sort of know the first half of this story, but I've never been able to find a clear reason why McLaughlin didn't move ahead with electrics. My theory is Sam McLaughlin famously didn't like marketing cars to women. He was the head of the company at the time. So it may have been something to do with that. But yeah, it's really interesting, because this was, the timing was perfect. This is when, McLaughlin was getting really big as a luxury car manufacturer. This is when electrics were at their most popular in big Canadian cities, admittedly for a very small level of popularity. But they clearly dumped a lot of money into this project, and it just vanished, sort of petered out by 1912. And I've never found a reason why.
Well, we have a few minutes left. If anyone has any further questions, I know Dumaresq and I can talk about these cars for hours on end. We've been through them. One of the things, Dumaresq, one of the things I think visitors are always surprised about is where the batteries were on the Rauch Lang.
I believe they're primarily like, isn't it they're under the floorboards? Like they're quite low down in the chassis and under the hood. I'm forgetting.
No, so they actually counterbalance. So they're actually in the
yes, of
what would be
course.
the hood and in the. I thought you would have known that one. Sorry, they're in the hood and in what you would consider the trunk. So they actually have batteries counterbalancing on the car. So it's about you know.
So that's on me for not knowing that
batteries
one.
in front and back. So what people often ask, what would it take to get our car up and running again? And really, it's buying 20 car batteries, which for anyone is quite a significant cost, especially if we're going to only drive it around a little bit. And so the same problem, basically the same problems you're still going to have with the ZENN Electric, all those years later, is with our traditional batteries. And batteries are still I just saw an announcement on GM today about investing in building batteries. So still relevant. Okay, one more question about the.
Side note to that. Sorry, just that I did not know where the batteries were on the Rauch Lang, and that's on me. But this is bringing back marketing material from the Canadian Cycle and Motor Ivanhoe, which was an early Canadian electric car from 1903. One of the things it extolled was it advertised itself as the first electric car where the batteries were under the hood and in the trunk area. And interestingly enough, it claimed that was a Canadian electric car innovation at the time that nobody else was doing, that had been invented by Canadian Cycle and Motor, that CCM now makes hockey equipment, among other things. So I wonder what the connection is there.
Interesting. So with the ZENN, there wasn't it wasn't a hybrid. It didn't there's no charging, when you braked it didn't charge it or anything. It just fully needed to be plugged in. I understand.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, it didn't have regenerative braking. It was not in terms of actual design, but in terms of function, basically a scaled up electric golf cart motor. It's bigger and it's faster, and it's a little bit beefier and handles better. But yeah, it is just battery to motor with nothing else in the way.
Yeah. And if you come to the museum and check ours out, so ours is a museum example. It came from the Montreal Biosphere, and so we've replaced. We still have the original hood, but over the hood there's plexi, and there's also plexi covering the battery compartment in the trunk as well. So you can easily see there's kind of your traditional sized car batteries up front and in back. Again, partly for the counterweight. For balance, but also just to put extra things in there. It's as light as you can get. One person. It's compared to some of the beastly cars we have in the museum that we have to move around, like the Brick Steamer weighing 3,600 pounds, for example. The Rolls Royces, we're just talking about one today, is at 4,400 pounds for our 39 Wraith. I think our 37 Wraith goes up from there. So some of these huge metal vehicles, this little electric, you can just push around like a golf cart basically. So any final questions for the night? Anything, Dumaresq, you want to throw in?
I'm the story I'm really excited to tell and dig more into is the Woods car. It was the longest chunk of the presentation. They're like this weird, cutting edge big business hype about, oh my god, electric taxi cabs. Everybody's building electric taxi cabs. And for 2 years, every billionaire and millionaire in North America is pouring all of their money into electric taxi cabs, and then it's just gone. It's a story that I think our early cars exhibit will dig into a little bit, but it's just a really sort of forgotten part of motoring history, that for a while, every major car company on earth and every major power company was looking to get into the car business just to make cabs. What a time.
Interesting. And then I think this is the first time in quite a while that we've had the Woods chassis on display. and we actually it came out of an auction actually in the Stratford area. So it's another Stratford connection for the automobile, and it came out of the same auction that our Chevy snowmobile did as well. So those lived together in the past and were brought both to the museum eventually. So both great acquisitions for the museum. So with that, I see it's just about 8 o'clock here. So thank you all for coming. Dumaresq, do you have anything final to add?
Stay tuned. We've got lots more exciting car stories to share.